Okay, so let's talk about eyes. So I've just brought up several images that I have in my personal library of different eyes that I've collected over the years. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why I like to use photographic reference over um, some of the other methods I've seen, which, namely speaking, would be kind of hand painting the sclera textures and the iris textures. Very basically, the reason I use photographs is because there's just more detail and more color variation in there than I would ever be able to get by trying to hand paint. And because it's very rare that we get extremely close to an eye, um, we want to make sure that we preserve as much of the realism as possible. And I find that by using photographs, it gets us there way faster, and we get some really awesome results when we set things up properly. I'm going to have all of these eyes um, put into a zip folder for you guys so you guys can use. Um, I know you guys have different ideas for different irises. Now, if you have an iris in mind that you don't see in this collection here, just go to Google and start searching with the making sure that the image parameters are set to beyond 2 megapixels. And you can find some really interesting especially iris textures that you can just swap in. Um, for our purposes, I use these photographs or one or two of these photographs simply to rebuild the sclera textures with the veins, and then typically I'll swap out the iris completely with a different iris that I've had in mind, or I may leave it depending on what I want. So the first thing that I have to do now, I'm just going to select one of these and work from it, but the same process can be applied to all of them. But I need to take out all the highlights and the reflections in the eye photography so I can actually use it. In fact, I've done that for this image here. And as you can see, I've taken out a lot of the reflections, a couple of other areas maybe I need to clean up here, but for the most part it's pretty clean, and it doesn't have much reflection detail in there. And we're getting a lot of amazing veining detail and color variation that I want to preserve. But because I've already done this image, I'm going to go and just choose randomly a different image and do the same thing. So let's pick this eye here. And this iris is really interesting. Some of you may decide to use it. Um, and what I would like about this image is just by happenstance, there isn't a lot of reflection in the sclera, which is really nice. So it requires a lot less painting. So what I want to do is take it out of the iris for the time being. So it's a pretty simple process, really. I just very methodically clone stamp stuff out and try to keep things organic and not reveal any kind of repeating patterns. And what I like to do is grab sections that work for me and copy and paste them in sections that aren't working. And then fade back on the edges. And then go in and try to take out some of the big features that might seem repeating. And very quickly we can clean this iris up. So I'm going to do that again on a different section, like so. And clean this up. What I'm trying to do is preserve the edges from the original of the iris. fact, I'm going to grab this section again. Try to fix, wasn't really happy what was going on there. So I'm just going to move this in place and fade some of this out ever so slightly. And just within a couple minutes, we're able to get some pretty clean textures. And then to top it off, what I like to do is go into the pupil, take pure black, and paint this in. Because the geometry we're using doesn't have a pupil modeled in, cut out, so we're actually going to fudge that and make sure that anywhere that there is pupil texture, it's going to be pure black in every single map. And then I'm just going in here to clean up some of these seams I'm seeing. There we go. So one thing I want to do is fix kind of this oblong shape. Because pupils, what's interesting about them is that they are relatively round. However, one thing that happens when people try to just hand paint is that they make these perfect circles, and it always looks CG. Whereas if we were to try to lasso a perfect circle here, you're going to see that it's relatively close, but it's not a perfect circle. There's the random jagged edges that you get just from by nature, and that is going to help sell the realism of this pupil rather than a clean circle, a perfect circle. So this is why another reason I like to use photographs. And yeah, we're pretty much done with this iris paint out. So we go from that to that. Pretty clean. And I'm happy with that. People really won't tell the difference because the eye, again, I mean, this may be the closest you'll ever get to on screen. So this is going to work fairly well for us. So I want you guys, for your first step, is to choose a photograph in this collection and do this exact process and paint out the reflections and the highlights. Now in an image, let's say for example here, where we have quite a bit more, and the reason I chose this photograph is it has more of the sclera that we may want to use over the iris. And this detail is just stuff that takes forever to hand paint, and we get all of it for free, which is fantastic. So in the case of this, this is a bit more tedious, but the same process of clone stamping. Just trying to get out all of these hot highlights. Now it doesn't have to be perfect. You can be a bit more gestural here because we don't really ever focus on scleras that much, and they're always moving and darting around, so it's not going to be a huge deal, but just try to do the best you can to clean stuff up, like so. And you'll notice when you're trying to clone stamp stuff from different areas of the source, how varied the color variation is. So be careful when you're clone stamping that you're actually sourcing from some like areas. And so from here, Actually going to take a paintbrush, paint this back in. Like so. So we can get that vein back. And then just continue. So I would grab like a section like this, copy and paste that entire area, so we can get some nice real estate. Again, I'm not worried about the iris, I just want this sclera. And systematically pull back. Like so. So now we're getting some nice clean sclera textures that we can use. So it takes a little bit of time to do some of this stuff, but in the end it's going to pay dividends when you go to use this for textures. Because there's so much variation and detail in here that you just don't notice when you're trying to recreate this from scratch. And stuff that would just take forever to reproduce. So just trying to take that highlight out. Repeating patterns are slightly more forgiving when you're doing scleras, so don't worry too much about where you're cloning from, because again, very rarely do you focus on the scleras in a character because they're quite small on screen and they're always darting around. So don't spend more time than you need when doing this. There we go. Now we have some really nice clean sclera textures that we can pull from and source and create some really interesting stuff. So we go from that to that. If you want, we can go in and add a little bit more interest to certain areas, because we rarely will see this far into the iris. So I may want to add a little bit more veining that I lost. From the original paint up. Like so. So we're getting a little bit extra vein detail. And that actually works pretty nicely, connects up. Cool. So then I save these images into a folder of cleaned up irises. So this would be a pretty good one to source from for an iris. Some really nice, interesting detail there. This one would be an excellent one to source from for rebuilding the sclera, so you can kind of mix and match. Because you'll notice in this image, the depth of field, the f-stop, is really preventing some of that detail from staying sharp. And the person who held their eye open didn't really hold it as open as they could Whereas, example for this one, this guy did an excellent job of keeping his eye open. So for my demo, I'll be using this guy's eye for the sclera work. But I'll show you how we can incorporate stuff like this and even some of the details in here. You want to be careful of not using extremely large veins too frequently, because those will be spotted very quickly. But some will be nice. This one's interesting because it goes and wraps right around the eye, so gives an interesting look. And so I have a couple other eyes in here that are pretty interesting. Resolution's not so great on this one, but it gives you an interesting look at other people's scleras and the coloration that you get. This guy's is quite yellow. So all this yellowing on all this extra red stuff we can do in post once we're painting in the PSD file. So don't worry too much about that. The point now is to clean up reference images that you want to use. And if none of these work for you guys, feel free to go on Google. And there's plenty of great eye reference that you find on Google. And then go through the process of cleaning up your images. And then have a nice little library of irises or scleras that you want to use and source from. And then we'll go into the next section. So in the next section, we're going to go into actually doing the initial projection in Mari, so we have everything lined up the way that we want. And then from there, we're going to bring it back into Photoshop and start painting the finished textures.